You could not have asked that at a better time.
No, I was just on my mind because I have somebody come to do a lecture at the show, and someone else was like, "Oh my God, you have to record it and put it up online." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"Oh, I didn't even." I'm like, I was just thinking about everything in the moment and not afterwards.
Yeah, usually what we do is with these free talks, we'll record them and then we'll put the video on the page where folks signed
Yeah.
up for the talk. So it'll all be there and you can share it and around.
Hold on.
Just gonna have everyone mute when they come in, please. How are things in Los Angeles?
Sorry, I muted myself. Pretty good, sunny. You know, it's LA.
LA-ish.
Yeah, I'm excited for summer to start to dwindle. Actually, see if watch the landscape kind of recover. But yeah, we're just wrapping up the show, so we have like a People's Graphic Design Archive event next Saturday. It's kind of cool where people can bring stuff and have it photographed and upload it to this huge online free database.
Wow.
And then the following week is the closing. Simon Reynolds, who's this great British music writer. He's gonna do a talk. So
Very cool.
let's quit out of that so you don't get the sound.
I think that was me actually. Sorry.
Oh, was it? I thought no, I think it might be me.
Maybe we both got an email at the same time.
Yeah.
Maybe it was
Oh no. Mine was from an electrician fixing something at CalArts.
Well, looks like we've got a pretty good group here and more online. So I'll go ahead and kind of give you a little introduction, as well as just kind of introducing, you know, for folks who maybe this is their first Index event, welcome. And I'm Ellie, I'm the director of Index. Index does a bunch of different types of programming geared around design and other creative disciplines, but kind of usually within the lens of the non-commercial or the kind of extracurricular sort of moments around design. And I love doing this work. It always brings really kind of interesting people together and creates sort of, you know, moments within, maybe some of you guys are in the middle of your workday right now, or maybe it's a long weekend or something for some, but you know, just kind of taking time out of the day to kind of come together is a really nice thing. So I want to thank Jonathan Magan, who's a friend of ours, who occasionally has like a brilliant idea to connect us with a friend or acquaintance of his to come and do a talk with us at Index. And Jonathan saw this exhibition that we're going to be talking about today a few months ago at CalArts, and he connected with Michael, who's the exhibition's curator and organizer, who super generously agreed to come and give a talk about the show with us at Index. And so Michael's a teacher at CalArts, and my boyfriend actually went to CalArts many years ago. He might be on this call. I don't know. Joel, you there? Anyway, I was, you know, chatting about this. I mentioned one evening that this talk was going to be happening, and that Michael had agreed to give this, you know, to come and talk about punk and new wave typography and aesthetics. And Joel was like, "Oh, I know Michael, and that totally tracks. And it turns out Michael had been his teacher years and years ago, and Joel remembered his passion for this niche of graphic design. And so I just wanted to kind of share that anecdote because I really love the way that this work continues to bring connections around and around again in circuitous ways. And I hope that by participating in our events, that our audience kind of begins to or continues to find and foster new connections, whether that's recognizing a familiar name in the list of people on Zoom or chatting in our Discord, which you can sign up for on our website. So I'm going to introduce Michael now and let him get started, but I also just wanted to give a special shout out to our pals, that's our patrons and liaisons, who support this work that we do with monthly financial contribution on Patreon, that we use then to pay ourselves and our small team to host programs like this for free or for really affordable price points, and to offer always at least one need-based scholarship to each of our courses. So if that's something that you're interested in supporting, you can become a PAL and get 10% off all of the things that we offer at Index by signing up on our website. So thanks if any of you are here and are PALs, that means a lot to us. So anyway, Michael Worthington is the founder of Counterspace, which is a design studio in Los Angeles, and he's the co-director of the graphic design program at CalArts. He curated the design shows Two Lines Align and Inside Out and Upside Down at Red Cat, and his writing has been published in Print, Slanted, and Threaded magazines, as well as various design books. And Michael runs the graphic design poster archive at CalArts, and he's edited and published the book Inside Out and Upside Down, Posters from CalArts, 1980 through 2019. And he's been teaching at CalArts since 1999. So thank you so much for joining us, Michael, and thank you also to Jonathan for putting us all together. I'll pass it over to you, and I can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Cool, thanks, Ellie, and thanks to Jonathan as well for setting this up, and David Carwin as well, who kind of connected Jonathan and I together. So I thought what I would do is a sort of two parts to this. One part is just to play a video that's a walkthrough of the show for people that can't get to LA to see the show. Give you an idea of the kind of scale of it, the kind of content of it, and just almost do like a gallery walkthrough talk over the top of that. And then the second part of the lecture, I have some specific pieces that I think it'd be interesting to look at in a little bit more detail, because you won't be able to see everything. In the video will give you more an idea about the overall kind of shape and content of the show. So the show is called Torn Apart, and it's basically pulled from a 7,000 piece collection of punk and new wave ephemera by a collector called Andrew Krivine, who lives in New York, who started collecting this work in 1976. And his collection has formed the basis of a couple of other shows, one at Cranbrook, one at the Museum of Art and Design in New York. But it's constantly evolving. So even in the time between that last show and this show, his collection has grown by thousands of pieces. So pretty much all the work in the show is from his collection. I spent 4 days in a storage room, a storage facility in New Jersey, pulling the work with him, which was the least exciting trip to New York ever. And then the show also has a bunch of photographs by a woman called Sheila Rock, who was a photographer in London, and starting around 76 and all the way through into the 80s as well. So I'm going to play you just the sort of walkthrough and talk over the top of it. The video might be a little bit chunky, but we'll see how it goes. So the show itself opens up with a giant kind of wall-size mural of John Lydon, who's Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols. And one of the things I love, that's a Sheila Rock photo, and one of the things I love about it is it's him with the posters behind him, and it really talks about how important kind of graphic design and graphic ephemera was to the beginning of the punk movement, certainly in England. So here you can see throughout the show, in the hallway, in the entrance, there's a couple of larger Sheila Rock photos. There's Susie Sue wearing a Vivienne Westwood Tits t-shirt. There's a bunch of vinyl that's there. just as filler, which is mostly actually my collection of vinyl. It's the only thing in the show that doesn't really belong to Andrew Krivines' collection. So when you walk in, you really get a feel for the kind of period and the time through the photography, through Sheela's photography, and that's really trying to capture the kind of energy of that early scene of kind of like punk and new wave. So when you first walk in, you're confronted by this large kind of like tidal wall, and then you kind of squeeze in through these side walls. And the show itself is a collection that isn't curated or organized in a way that necessarily makes sense to an audience. It's not chronological, and it's not thematic. So for instance, these two back walls that you're seeing close-ups of are all just work that is black and white. It has very little else in common. It spans different time period. Some of it is from the US, some of it is from the UK. And the idea is to try and create an atmosphere or a kind of a hanging of the work that allows people to sift through it and discover things. So it forces you in a way to not kind of succumb to the curator's point of view, but more to investigate and discover things that you find interesting yourself. So this is the downstairs room, and the work is really, most of the downstairs is early punk stuff. So it's mainly from 76, 77, a little bit into 78. And it's by a number of different designers. One of the things that's interesting about this show is there are certain iconic pieces, and we'll look at some of those in detail later, that are clear. It's really clear, you know, who designed those pieces. There's a kind of history to them. But then there's plenty of other things in the show that we have no idea who designed them. And it's really hard to track some of these things down. And at the same time, there's also what I found out from digging through Andrew Krivines' archive and pulling this show together. There were a lot of things that I'd never seen before. So what was interesting for me as a curator was it wasn't purely looking at a body of work that I already knew and picking the familiar kind of iconic pieces, even though some of them are in the show, like the Jamie Reed, Nevermind the Bollocks, Sex Pistols poster that you can see there. But at the same time, I was as a curator, I was discovering and finding all kinds of things while I was digging through this archive. So downstairs, there's one whole wall of Sex Pistols work, which is mostly designed by Jamie Reed. So it ranges from the very early kind of silkscreen and photocopy work that he did, a lot of the cut and paste aesthetic that you can see in the early work he did for the Pistols, you know, in a lot of ways shapes about 2 years of kind of like the aesthetics of punk rock. But he had a huge range. He's a really interesting kind of left-wing, you know, anti-authoritarian designer, very influenced by the Situationists. You can see in the Pretty Vacant poster that there is a kind of direct lift from a Situationist piece. But at the same time, he's known for this, very much this kind of cut and paste, sort of lo-fi aesthetic, using kind of like language, using ripped up typography, using kind of images that are meant to slightly kind of shock. But at the same time, he also made very slick work that's kind of parodies of other things. And you can see that in this Rock and Roll Swindle fake American Express card, which is a poster that Jamie Reed made. So he's got this like kind of incredible range, and part of the show was to try and get beyond just the familiar pieces from certain kind of like punk and new wave designers, and to show a real range in the work. So this is the back of the other wall that's also just black and white, very eclectic, all kind of like mixed together. And the show is called Torn Apart, and that partly refers to that early aesthetic, that early kind of cut and paste aesthetic that Jamie Reed exemplifies. But it's also to do with the relationship between punk and new wave, which is something that I've always found, you know, super interesting, because when when punk kind of like started, New York, 1976, punk and new wave were synonymous terms. They were really used interchangeably at that time, and they were applied to bands in New York that had a diverse range from, Eddie and the Hot Rods that you can see here to, Blondie, Talking Heads, the Ramones. And then as things moved over to England in sort of 1970, late 76, 77, you got the Sex Pistols and the Clash. The term new wave kind of gets dropped and it just becomes punk rock. And there's a whole wall of kind of Clash posters in this downstairs space as well. And new wave becomes dropped as a term, and then it gets picked up later in America. And in England, it was really used as a kind of catch-all term, in a lot of ways more like the way people use indie to describe kind of any music that's, alternative or independent. So new wave was used like that. And then sort of 1979 onwards, when the musical focus switched back to America, new wave is almost this kind of derogatory term in a way, because it then becomes co-opted by these larger record companies that sort of throw anything in there. So part of the title is to do with both the formal aesthetics of a lot of the work, but also to do with this relationship and how the work is kind of considered culturally, how it's considered in terms of its audience. So this is the rest of the downstairs space. One of the things that I liked about putting together the two theme walls of the Clash and the Sex Pistols is you get to see a kind of range of all the different work that's happening there. And you get to see the kind of progression through a few different years as well, working with different artists. Also downstairs is a series of Sheila Rocks photographs as well. And these really capture the kind of punk rock scene in London in 1976. And one of the things that I love about the photographs is that they're very candid, and you just see that a lot of this is kids that are like, 15, 16, an exception being Jordan, who's there outside the sex shop, who was, Vivienne Westwood's inspiration for a lot of clothing and fashion. But you see how, in a lot of ways, a lot of punk was driven by this very kind of like working class rebellion, if you like. And a lot of it was kind of teenage kids who were rebelling against their parents as much as anything else. So as you walk into the second floor of the exhibition, there's kind of some seminal posters by seminal punk bands. So the Buzzcocks, X-Ray Spex, The Damned, Stiff Little Fingers, and some of these we'll look at a little bit later. And part of what the show's trying to do is to look at both work that is made more by, if you like, semi-professional designers. I wouldn't even, at this stage in sort of 77, a lot of it is not that professionalized. A lot of it is still people that are friends of the bands or people that are untrained, making the work. But as you walk up through the stairway in the exhibition, there's about 200 flyers, and the flyers become this really interesting point because there's about 400 posters in the exhibition, about 200 flyers, about 400 other pieces of ephemera. So there's about 1,000 pieces in total. So it's a pretty large exhibition. But the flyers take on a different kind of vibe because they're often not produced by professional designers. They're often produced by the band themselves or friends in the band, even at a later stage when, even into the 80s when design has become professionalized. So I kind of, the stairway is really trying to look at, feel like you're walking into a club where there's a bunch of stuff on the wall and it's more about again, more about the overall impact of a mass of visual pieces of work, like hitting you in the face, and you have to pick through it and sift through it. So you can see in this overview, the exhibition is hung from a kind of top line, and then it's 3 or 4 posters deep. So it's pretty dense, and it's partly, again, to make people sift through it and to have this sense of discovery in the work, which in a lot of ways relates back to how graphic design functioned before the internet in terms of its relationship to music. you couldn't see bands. You couldn't often even hear bands. You know, a lot of punk and new wave stuff wasn't necessarily being played on the radio. There was no internet. There weren't that many TV shows. This is, you know, pre-MTV even. So graphic design becomes the visual conduit for, you know, how does this music exist in the world, and how do people recognize each other, you know, in culture. So again, part of that is to be able to just like sift through, have the audience, you know, kind of sift through this and discover things. So Upstairs is mostly shifts a little bit later, a little bit more into new wave. And one of the things that that's interesting at this point, you know, you can see a poster there that's, you know, entitled, there's got no wave on it, and it's got a sort of punk aesthetic and punk fashion in it. So everything is very eclectic and very mixed up at this point. I think punk was maybe one of the last things that was a sort of mono culture in a lot of ways, where if you liked punk, you couldn't like a lot of other things. You know, you could maybe like a little bit of heavy metal, but that was about it. You couldn't like punk and like disco. You couldn't like, you know, you couldn't mix those things. And once punk had opened up this, both musically and graphically, the idea that anybody can do anything, that also that you can do it yourself, that there isn't a, you don't have to get permission from either, you know, a class system or some kind of like hierarchy. You can just do whatever you want to make music or to make design. And once that happened, it opened up basically a kind of really broad range of musical and graphical experimentation. And I think that's what interests me about the term, you know, new wave, because in a lot of ways, it's just a catch-all for a million different things that were all happening between, you know, 1979 and 1982, really. And you can see that in things like there's this Vibrators record sleeve, which is an amazing piece of graphic design. You know, it's super complex. It's using some found imagery, but there's a sense of this kind of beginning of postmodern pluralism, where things aren't just as singular as punk anymore, but the possibilities are endless. So suddenly you've got a fusion of electronic music. You've got a fusion of the influence of, you know, world music, industrial music, and they're all being mixed together. Also looking at bands like the Cramps, looking back at, you know, rock and roll and the history of that, and pulling that into a more contemporary context. And so there's this very kind of like high level of eclecticism happening. And you see that in the music, but you really see it in the graphic design, where there's kind of, there's no single aesthetic anymore, in a way that the beginning of punk, in a lot of ways, I think Jamie Reed really defined the aesthetic, certainly British punk. And you see that being regurgitated and reiterated in the early years. And then as soon as, you know, sort of post-punk, a new wave comes along, you see this more radical kind of shift into a broader range of eclectic aesthetics. And that was one of the things about the show that was interesting in trying to select this work from this much broader, much larger kind of body of work, was to try and figure out what are the curatorial criteria for picking this. And I think what was interesting was, I feel like we're often drawn to the music itself as nostalgia. So I was super excited to dig through this stuff because it was all bands that I loved as a kid. And I think that's why Andrew Cravine, who owns the collection, that's why we got on so well, was because he would pull things out and we'd both have stories about, oh, I went to see this band, or you know, I remember this. But as a curator, it can't just be about nostalgia. So the focus of the show was really trying to be about graphic design. And it was trying to look at what are pieces that are interesting in terms of typography, in terms of color, in terms of production, composition, concept, language, trying to look at those tools of graphic design and apply them as a criteria to why you would pick these posters. And what that means is sometimes there's posters in the show that are terrible bands, but are amazing posters, for instance. And likewise, there's amazing bands with terrible posters that we decided not to put in the show as well. And there's some things that are iconic, that are interesting because they've become iconic. And there's other things that are maybe equally as interesting because they're just very obscure. And one of my favorite things was what the work that I discovered that I'd never seen before in Andrew's collection. So here you can see, like this is the last wall upstairs. So again, time period is mixed. There's like Black Flag alongside, the Buzzcocks birthday party. There's a lot of Barney Bubbles work in there. The shirt that you can see here is a Barney Bubbles ad. So time periods, genres are deliberately kind of mixed up as a way to try and, like I said, to force people to look at the design itself. So I'm just going to speed the video up a little bit while we look at the rest of this. Okay. So yeah, most of the, so this is the end of kind of the posters. So you can see it starts to get more into a recognizable aesthetic with new wave bands that are recognizably new wave, perhaps a little bit more electronic. And also the production techniques change a lot as well from a design point of view. It goes from being very, very handmade to being much more printed and commercial. So the other aspects of the show, apart from the posters, there's a bunch of different clothing and a bunch of different ephemera in there. So these are early shirts from about 76, 77 for Generation X, the Sex Pistols. There's a Devo costume. There's some clothing from Boy, which is really interesting, and Vivienne Westwood's both Sex and Seditionaries stores. And Andrew Krivine, the collector, was actually his cousin was John Krivine, who was one of the founders of Boy, which was an early clothing company in London, an early punk rock store. And Boy and Vivienne Westwood's Sex and Seditionaries would produce T-shirts together and silkscreen them and interchange them. And what's interesting is just that beginning moment. Punk was really punk and new wave were really infused again with that graphic identity, not just for the music, but for fashion as well. And part of that was because in this kind of monoculture idea, if you were walking down the street, how would you know that somebody else was the same subculture as you, that somebody else liked the same music that you like? And part of that became to do with, well, what does your hair look like? What do your clothes look like? What kind of T-shirt are you wearing? So, even before the music came out, there was actually an aspect to, fashion. Even before the music was branded, actually fashion was branding things. So there's a series of cases upstairs as well as the clothing. There's a number of zines. One that we were just looking at is an early Linda Sterling and Collage magazine that was the basis of the Buzzcocks Orgasmatic poster. So it's looking at part of the ephemera upstairs is trying to look at all the different ways that graphic design got implemented. I think there's a very visible history of album sleeve design. There's plenty of books, there's plenty of stuff online, but that was only one part of how design operated in relationship to music and music culture. So the upstairs is really looking at a lot of that other ephemera that's surrounding it. So that partly means clothing, partly means buttons, stickers, zines, press releases, all kinds of different things that made up part of that culture. So the clothes are some of my favorite things in the show, partly because they're all original pieces. The Vivienne Westwood shirt is 79, I think. A lot of the early boy stuff is 77. So just to be able to have these, items still in their original condition. One of the things that freaked me out was just that all the clothes are so small because everybody wore everything very tight. But I think everyone was just thinner back then as well. And this is a piece we're going to look at later, which is the original price list from Vivienne Westwood's store. So you can see how graphic design manifests itself. There's a Stiff Records clock there that's made out of vinyl. There's a Blondie, that's a case, a Blondie case that you can wrap around your school book. So you could have a Blondie, take your Blondie book to school. But design becomes very much this, this way that the culture gets represented, that the music gets represented. So this case is full of zines, and you can see the real difference between the stuff that's happening in the 70s that's still maybe tied to a more American aesthetic of sort of outsider culture and comic culture, particularly on the East Coast, and then moving into things to zines that are definitely more British, hand produced, cut and paste, photocopied. And Ripped and Torn was also one of the influences on the title of the show as well, which was a great zine. So you can see it jumps around. So Slash is very important. LA magazine. You've got Punk magazine in New York. Later on, there's things like Toxic Graffiti, which was a anarcho-punk magazine. The Stranglers zine that you can see there is actually in one of the photographs downstairs by Sheila Rock from 1976, which is pretty cool. And I wish, in a lot of ways, these are all under glass. And one of the things that was great was actually to be able to look through these zines and to see not just the cover designs, but to look at all the other things that are in there, like ads especially, where they're being made by other people. So it becomes, again, very, very kind of eclectic in how they're being made. So there's a few more clothes upstairs. Some of the clothes were actually Andrew Cravine's original clothes. So as I said, his cousin was one of the founders of Boy, and Andrew would travel from New York every summer and spend the summer in London with his family there. He had an extended family there. And so he was hanging out with, the Clash and the Sex Pistols and, going to Sex and Seditionaries and buying clothes and posters and all this stuff in real time in 1976 as a spotty little American teenager. Unfortunately, he collected this work at the time for a couple of years. He also went to university in England, so he continued to collect the work, left it at his grandmother's or his aunt's house in England, and it sat there for 20 years, during which time Andrew then went off and had a separate career. And then he came back to it about 15 years ago and decided that, luckily his aunt kept all the work and didn't throw it away. And he decided this was going to be the foundation of a collection. And so then he started actually buying these things, building up this massive kind of archive. So now we're just walking back downstairs, so the other side of the flyers. And again, you can see that it's the flyers are definitely more about just trying to get at the energy and the eclecticism. And I think I'm also, one of the things that interests me is just how does graphic design function within this kind of like culture, and the fact that the flyers are often people's first introduction to graphic design. They're often kind of like raw. You can look at things like Raymond Pettibone's flyers for Black Flag that are really early and really rough before he sort of develops his career a little bit more. And then we're back downstairs with Johnny Rotten. Okay, so that's an overview of the show to try and just give you a feeling of the sort of the density of it and the scale of it in a lot of ways. And I thought what would be interesting would be to now look at a few pieces in a little bit more detail, so we can just talk about those a little bit more. So let me just try and pull up the other screen. So Ellie, is that working as the full screen? Okay. So one of the things that the show is at the Pacific Design Center, which is a kind of two-story gallery that was part of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles for a long time. And they dropped that space during COVID, and then the PDC now operates it as a kind of independent space. So the show happened fairly fortuitously in that I just happened to, a colleague of mine, Luis Santos, happened to send out an email saying, you know, there's this space if anybody wants to propose a show. And then at the same time, Andrew's brother emailed me, because I run the poster archive at CalArts, asking me if I was interested in doing a show with Andrew's poster archive. And that it literally 2 emails in pretty much the same day. So putting those two things together was kind of how we put the show together. So the work runs from 76 to 86. Like I said, 76 is really the beginning of punk in England, but it's also the sort of tail end of what is the sort of punk new wave kind of movement, especially in New York. So you've got this 74 to 76, you've got this kind of crossover from like rock and roll and, you know, American kind of outsider culture, really based a lot in New York, shifting into then being very influential into England. And you can see that in these early punk magazine covers where, you know, a lot of the aesthetic still feels, you know, the way that things are drawn. These are the one on the right is a John Hallstrom illustration, and he was the editor and designer of and founder of Punk magazine. But you can see how that aesthetic still feels very much like kind of American rock in a lot of ways. And even the bands that you see, you know, Blue Oyster Cult, and, you know, Eddie, and then you sort of drifting into Patti Smith, Eddie and the Hot Rods. So those bands like the Ramones, like, you know, Richard Hell, those bands shifted across to England, and they were highly influential in influencing, and the New York Dolls earlier as well, in influencing both the aesthetics, you know, the fashion, as well as the music of early punk in England. The Richard Hell poster on the right is one of my favorite things in the show, partly because on the back of it, you can see the red pen showing through. On the back of it is just scrawled some dates for, I think, an advert for the next show. So somebody clearly didn't care enough about the poster to keep, you know, to think that it was an artifact worth keeping. So I grew up in England, and you know, punk was a little bit before my time. I was mostly a post-punk, new wave, Joy Division kind of kid. One of the things that's been really interesting for me has been going back, and especially in light of the Pistols TV show that's happened as well, was looking at how the early years of punk have become mythologized, and looking at how in a lot of ways history becomes this very selective kind of point of view. Even our recent history, it's hard to know what is real and what is being looked at from whose perspective. So this is one of the things that I thought was interesting in the Pistol show, and that came out in curating some of this work. On the left is a Sheila Rock photo of a band called the Moors Murderers, which is actually Chrissie Hynde from the Pretenders. who is lying upside down. Steve Severin from Susie and the Banshees playing playing guitar in the background, I think, playing bass in the background. And one of the things that's interesting is that case at the front that says Bazooka Joe. So Bazooka Joe were Adam from Adam and the Ants. They were his first band, and they were a rock and roll band. And the first gig the Sex Pistols ever played was supporting Bazooka Joe at St. Martin's College of Art. So there's this, even in this photo, there's all this kind of like history that's tied together between all these different bands. And then in the Pistols show, you know, Chrissie Hynde is this main character who's actually a conflation of a lot of other people. So even that is somewhat of a fabrication. But the poster on the right is interesting because it's a really early Adam and the Ants poster from 1978, and it's designed by Stuart Goddard, who is Adam Ant. And then what it starts to get at is, yeah, where do these punk aesthetics come from? So on the one hand, you've got this very raw cut and paste, we're going to do it ourselves, we're going to build it ourselves. And on the other hand, you've actually got kids that went to art school. So, you know, Adam Ant went to art school and, you know, learned how to do things. You know, so did people from the Pistols, so did people from the Clash, and a lot of the time the work is being made by people that they know that might not be trained as graphic designers, but they're trained as visual artists. So there's a sort of myth of incompetency in a lot of ways. One of the other things that's really interesting is this work is being produced at a time when there's the means of production are really different from now. So a lot of work is made by hand, a lot of work is collaged, things are shot on a stack camera to make things bigger. Stuff is either screen printed or made with a black and white, you know, copier. And it's done really cheaply, and it's done in a really raw way. It's not made by commercial graphic designers. It's often made by people that are friends of the band. And there's a kind of immediacy and an energy to that you can see in both the Jamie Reed Anarchy poster on the left, famously, and less famously, this Helen Wellington Lloyd poster for a famous gig that was the Pistols, the Clash, and the Buzzcocks all playing at the Screen on the Green in Islington in London. And you can see how that aesthetic carries across. This is an early flyer that Malcolm McLaren, the Sex Pistols manager, made. And what I find interesting about it is it's got that kind of, you know, handmade energy, but it uses language in a way, and it uses attitude in a way. So there's kind of, it's challenging the status quo. And part of what it's also challenging is the kind of class system in England. And in a weird way, design was part of that. Design was out of reach of most kind of working class kids, both the tools to make design and the knowledge of design as well. Because you're in a period where, you know, in the 70s in England, where working class people are just being able to go to college, and college was actually free, paid for by the government. So that was an early flyer that Malcolm McLaren made for a Pistols gig. And one of my favorite things in the show is this double-sided pricing sheet from Seditionaries, from Vivienne Westwood's store. And here you can see the t-shirt designs. So it's like, you know, Anarchy design, you know, you can see the early Jamie Reed Pistols designs, but also things that are being made by both Boy and Seditionaries. They would share the same t-shirt designs. But what blew me away is you could buy these things. When you look at the prices, you could buy a shirt for $5 or £5, you know, and you could buy a long sleeve muslin, you know, John Lydon shirt for $6.50. And it was just like, oh my God, if you'd have bought all those things, then you'd definitely be laughing now. And a lot of these things were made to, again, in this kind of classist structure, a lot of them were made to try and offend deliberately the kind of old British post-war kind of, you know, kind of stodgy sort of aesthetics. And there's a quote on the other side of this that I think is really important, where it's, you know, their active extremism is all they care about, because that's what counts. To jump right out of the 20th century as fast as you possibly can in order to create an environment you can truthfully run wild in, which is kind of a pretty good mission statement, I think, for both the Pistols and for kind of punk and for design as well. So you can see how these are two Sheila Rock photos. So this is both, on the left is Susie Sue from Susie and the Banshees wearing a shirt, and Subi, who was just a punk scenester. And some of the things that are funny, and these shirts like turn up in the Pistol show, for instance. But one thing that I've also discovered things doing this, curating this show and looking at this work. So if you look at these two shirts, the one on the right's got a black border, the one on the left doesn't. The one on the right is actually a Vivienne Westwood shirt, because the Vivienne Westwood one was printed with a black border. The one on the left is probably the inspiration for the Vivienne Westwood shirt, which weirdly enough was a shirt printed by Fredrickson of Hollywood, which is a lingerie store in LA on Sunset. I think it's on Sunset Boulevard. So even that, and that begins this idea of kind of appropriation as well, and which is a big part of a lot of the aesthetics that you start to see. So on the left here, you can see, a poster, a very infamous poster for Pistols gig, which is pretty hard to do today, to shock this much, to have like a naked teenage boy smoking a cigarette. There's everything that's wrong about it. So you can see that's the t-shirt graphic then being used as a poster for a gig. On the right is a really early Jamie Reed Pistols poster, where you can see he's using a lot of these. And Jamie Reed studied printmaking at art college, and actually made these amazingly complex, multicolored kind of prints. And this is an early Sex Pistols promo poster. And if you look carefully on the right-hand side, Steve Jones is actually wearing one of those same shirts as well. So you can see how graphic design becomes like a really important part of the culture in a lot of ways. It's what the people are wearing on stage. It's how everybody identifies themselves, even before the music kind of comes out. So this is a boy parachute shirt. So you can see, and again, some of these sort of aesthetics are trying to be applied to both the clothing and to the the posters and everything else as well. So these are slightly later Jamie Reed pieces. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the right-hand side is much later, when the Pistols are kind of breaking up and John Lydon's left. But it does start to get again at this idea of kind of appropriation, where he's looking at, kind of like Disney stuff. He's looking at cinema popcorn packaging, but using language as well. So there's these kind of tools of graphic design that are really there in their kind of raw and rudimentary states. And like I said, there's a lot of these designers who were working with the bands were connected to them through art school. So these are two posters these are actually reprints, but the original posters were made by Sebastian Conrad, who went to art school with Joe Strummer from The Clash and Paul Simonon. And his dad is Sir Terence Conrad, who owns Habitat in London, who's like Sir Terence Conrad, super famous, graphic designer, now, multimedia. Their whole family are now famous sort of successes of industrial design, but they started out, Sebastian was part of this scene in London. So again, and he was like a lot of them, they were educated, they were rich kids, but they were kind of, trying to, in a lot of ways, use design as a kind of critique of what was happening within the culture at the time. But there were people as well who were, I think, highly kind of skilled in this moment. And one of the things I like about the show is discovering things. So one group that I discovered through Andrew's show was a group called X3. And there were two guys from London who would produce these amazing silk screens. So these are two of them. The one on the left is Joe Strummer. The one on the right, Jimmy Percy from Sham 69. Both of them are based on Jill Furmanovsky photographs. And Jill was like a very famous, mostly music press, live photography, but a lot of black and white early punk photography. And they would sell these. They would make these amazing screen prints and sell them for £1 each out of the back of a van at the concerts, which is just an amazing thing to be doing back then. It's a lot like I feel like it's a lot like the designer as producer that happens now, or designer is sort of mini entrepreneur in a lot of ways. But their work is amazing because it doesn't look like it's nearly 50 years old. I mean, the way that they use kind of color and split fountains, just really, really beautiful. So these are other X3 posters. So these are scattered throughout the show. Again, the show isn't structured in a way that thematically, like all the work of one designer is grouped together. It's definitely kind of split up and dispersed throughout the show. The poster on the right, interestingly, is an album cover for the Cortinas or a single cover for the Cortinas that was designed by Hypnosis, who were a very famous graphic design company in the 70s who designed album covers for Pink Floyd. And then they took their design and gave it to X3 to reprint and make it feel more kind of punk rock in a lot of ways. And you can see how things like the photocopier and the means of production influence the design. So these are all silk screens, but you can see how there's no midtones, everything's high contrast. So the tools, those kind of like cheap and available means of production, even at this kind of high-end version, are really affecting how the work is produced. And the same with the typography. So a lot of the, I know this is going to sound alien to a lot of younger people, but before the computer, you couldn't set your own type. You either drew it by hand, or you had to have rub down lettering, or you had to trace it and draw it and then put it on a stack camera and make it bigger or smaller and get it to be the right size and paste it up again. So it was this very laborious process, and not a lot of typefaces were available. Everything was very expensive. And you can see that throughout a lot of this work, where the typography is a result of the means of production and the lack of availability. So one of the other people that I discovered from doing this is a guy called John Angus, who was a designer in England at the University of Lancaster, and bands would play all the universities as a circuit. And every time somebody played in Lancaster, he worked at the university, and he would make these silkscreen posters. And they're all amazing, and they're all often really oddball and weird and don't really relate to the bands as much as they should. But again, you can see things like, the stenciled lettering, things that are made by hand. The poster on the right, I really love, because Duran Duran are the third support act, which is hilarious. It must have been one of the first concerts that they ever played. And he has a whole body of work. And again, these are all fairly small scale silk screens. And it's really him now functioning as an independent kind of artist / designer, where he can do whatever he wants. So I'm not sure what the bat has to do with the Buzzcocks, for instance. And just to get back to the typography, so on the left-hand side, there's a Stiff Little Fingers Rock Against Racism poster, and you can see how it's all kind of hand-drawn, all the typography. Whereas on the right, if you look at the undertones lettering at the top, you can see how it's actually made up of different typefaces turned sideways. So the D is an A turned sideways, the E is an M, and that's probably done with Letraset, with like leftover rub down lettering to kind of make that. So a lot of what we think of as the sort of ransom node or randomness or, hand-drawn aesthetics are really coming out of these sort of these cheap means of production, or the only means that were often available pre-computer. And in the show, I deliberately pulled as many silk screens as I could, because I feel like they're they're the place where there's often a little bit more kind of time spent with the typography, the composition, the color palettes. And again, the means of production is super visible. So on the left is a Bloodless Pharaohs poster, which was Brian Setzer from the Stray Cats. It was his first band, and on the right is this very seminal Buzzcocks poster made by Malcolm Garrett. And Malcolm went to Manchester Poly, trained as a graphic designer. Him and Peter Saville went to school together. And I think as stuff begins to shift out of punk, sort of 78, 79, you also see more trained designers, less artists, because I think earlier on it's more artists making design, and then it turns into designers making design. And you can see suddenly there's a grid or there's a structure, and the type gets a little bit cleaner, and the type feels more kind of professional. The compositions are tighter. And you see this in Malcolm Garrett's work a lot. It's very, very graphic at a time, even when other things were very rough. There's a lot of flat colors, there's a lot of shapes, there's a lot of, more kind of modernist typography. And the images that he used were in that zine that you got a glimpse of earlier, which were made by Linda Sterling, which are these beautiful kind of Dada-esque photo collages. But Malcolm's work, I think, is really important because it starts to shift into the realm of actual graphic design. But importantly, I think still kind of experimental and challenging graphic design, and some oddball choices that you don't really notice that were weird at the time, like the smaller type on the poster on the left is Antique Olive, one of my favorite typefaces. But it would be weird to even think about him using that then. As well as the abstraction, the flat colors. The photograph is actually, again, a Jill Furmanovsky photograph. And even in the poster on the right, you start to get into materiality. So that's actually printed with a metallic ink and a fluorescent orange. So you start to get at really real graphic design, commercially produced, mass-produced graphic design. One of the other things that I found from curating the show that's really interesting is, what were these designers being influenced by? There was no design history being taught, even for the kids that went to design school. Excuse me, there was barely any design history. What was taught was art history with a little bit of focus on design or art movements that were sympathetic to design or that had designers. So constructivism, the Bauhaus, futurism, Dada. And you see all of those aesthetics, because they're being taught to those designers, you see those coming into punk and new wave design. So this generation X poster, very Russian constructivist. Even in the Clash poster on the right, you can see the same kind of ideas of taking, some of the shapes, some of the colors, some of the typography from Russian constructivism, in this case, particularly, the Stenberg brothers, and looking at how that gets reused and regurgitated, because there's no design history right now. And then you've also got that kind of collage aesthetic that you see with Linda Sterling that later on gets so exaggerated and so complex in an amazing way. So these are later posters from, I think, from about 1980 that are for the British anarcho-punk band Crass, and Guy Voucher, who made these. They were fold-out posters that actually contained the record themselves. And they're just they're so incredibly complex, and they're full of jokes, political satire, all kinds of things. And for me, the irony was always that Crass had the most amazing graphics in the world, but they're just such a terrible sounding band. If you go back and listen to them now, it's really hard to listen to them. But their politics were great, and their aesthetics were great as well. And you can see the same thing happening in America around the same time with Winston Smith and the dead Kennedys. The same idea. These were posters that folded down that came with the records. And the idea of kind of, you know, appropriation, of found imagery, and the idea of kind of like political satire through collage is really, really evident in these works. Ali, I think I've got 5 more minutes. I'm going to go fast. Okay.
Keep going. Yeah, this is great.
Okay, so then, you know, at the same time, you've got those rough and ready collages. Again, you've also got, you know, what's starting to become much more polished, you know, design, much more conscious of, you know, color palette, composition, typography. And I think that's really exemplified by Barney Bubbles, whose work is on the right, who was a British designer who you can find lots of. There's a book about his work, and you can find a lot of his work. But he worked under a lot of pseudonyms as well. And one of the things that was really interesting about this show was discovering all this work that I really liked, that I didn't know that Barney Bubbles had made, because he'd put a different name on the work, or no name at all. And he was insanely eclectic. Like, he could do millions of different styles. Really quite amazing. But as we move more into the new wave stuff, you start to see it getting cleaner. You see these flat colors, you see way more diagonals, you see way more shapes. There's a level of kind of control. And again, some of that is coming out of means of production, some of it is coming out of design aesthetics. And I think that shift's really evident in something like Factory Records, you know, with obviously Peter Saville really involved in a lot of the work. And you can see that eclecticism in the lineup in this flyer on the left, where there's just like such a weird group of bands that don't really belong together. And that's the new wave thing. That you know, in 1979, 1980, you could suddenly like all of these things together. So you've got, you know, Robert Gordon and the Pretenders and, you know, Wire and the Human League all playing together. And so there's kind of that eclecticism starts to come out at this point, and then individual designers start to figure out a voice and get a little bit more focused. The flyer on the right is actually John Savage, who worked with Linda Sterling, and John Savage went on to be the art director of the Face, amongst other things. So obviously, you know, Saville, super seminal, you know, artwork for Joy Division suddenly becomes much more minimal, much more kind of controlled. But it's happening elsewhere as well. The poster on the right is Jocelyn Costa, I think. And all of this Joy Division stuff is insanely collectible now. So even just finding things to put into the show were really difficult. This poster is particularly famous because the designer, Mark Reeder, spelt Joy Division's name wrong. So it's this transition from Joy Division to New Order. But it's, you know, New Order were Joy Division, which is kind of quite amazing. He blames the typesetter, but and you can see how, like, you know, there's this gravestone imagery. It's very minimal, but that idea of appropriation is still really there. So this is, yeah, Peter Saville's New Order poster, which was also the record sleeve for the 12-inch movement. You know, and on the left, you can see DePero's futurist, you know, typography, where you can see, and Saville is, you know, deliberately, it's not copying this without acknowledging it. He's deliberately doing it and talking about kind of appropriation, acknowledging where it's come from. And this becomes a strategy for him. And there's pieces in the show, some of which are more successful than others. So here you can see this Hervé Morvan, you know, poster, which I think is really early in Morvan's career, because later on he does a lot of kids illustrations. And I think this is earlier, when this might even be as early as kind of the 30s or late 30s, early 40s, where Morvan's looking back at, you know, Cassandra and like French posters. But you can see, yeah, and Saville acknowledges this kind of idea of appropriation. But again, that's a very postmodern idea. And one of the later pieces in the show is this poster for the Hacienda Club in Manchester, you know, which is part of Factory Records, which is 1986, which is by Octavo. Simon Johnson, who teaches at Arts, part of Octavo, the Octavo group from England, he teaches at Art Center. in England. But what for me, what was great about this poster is it's still a silkscreen. At this point, Octavo are making these insanely complicated 12 color, printed pieces on tracing paper for their magazine and for other record sleeves. But then we're still in, when it comes to the poster, we've still got this this silkscreen means of production. And one of the other, this is the last, I think the last thing I'm going to show, but one of the other things, my favorite thing that I discovered from curating this show that I'd never heard of was a designer called Martin Kay. And he was a British guy who lived in Amsterdam, and he lived and worked underneath a club called the Paradiso, which I think is still going. And somebody told me the last few years, I think for a while, Experimental Jet Set were doing their posters. But in the early 80s, maybe 80 to maybe 79 to 83, something like that, Martin Kay would produce these posters, and they would be all over Amsterdam. And they would be these small format, silkscreen prints. And they were nearly always just typographic, all pre-computer, all produced by hand. And there's some of the weirdest, eclectic kind of so wrong for the time, but looks so great now kind of pieces of design. So they're often very, very simple, small typographic moves. And there's actually there's one book from a few years ago. There's another book that I think Paradiso just put out. But they're these beautiful kind of split fountains, and he would make these all by hand. So a lot of the type would be either cut with Rubylith by hand with a knife, or would be, Letraset and shot on a stack camera. And for me, they have this real nostalgia, because I look at a lot of these typefaces and I remember having Letraset, having rub down lettering with these typefaces on. So on the left, I think the type that says The Fall, I think that's a typeface called Croissant, because it looks like a croissant. And I think one of the other typefaces I think it was called Machine or something like. But so for me, these are these great pieces of nostalgia, and they're also just these very kind of eccentric, where he would just do whatever he wanted and just do these kind of very vernacular typography choices in a lot of ways. So I think those were probably the thing that was the most inspiring to discover, this whole body of work by a designer that I'd never heard of, and a body of work that in a lot of ways is somehow stands outside of a lot of the other punk and new wave work. So the last thing I'm going to end with is just in the show, there's also, there's a bunch of buttons, there's a bunch of stickers. And I think part of what I like about showing all of those things at once is you get to see the eclecticism all at the same time. You get to see the different kind of, the different typography, the different approaches to design. Some, like Chris Morton from Stiff Records, purely language-based, almost like advertising work. And you got Barney Bubbles, who's like such a formalist. Peter Saville is a minimalist. So I think I'm drawn to the eclecticism of everything that happened in this short period of time. And I think more than anything, it's like I said, it's this combination of two things that I love. So it's this music, it's the music that I grew up with, that I still listen to, that I'm still interested in, and the idea of graphic design connecting to music. It's how I became a graphic designer. I started out as a photographer, photographing bands. Then I started to make album sleeves, and then I got more into design. So in a lot of ways, my entry point to visual culture was through this stuff, through the music. Okay, I think that's it.
Wow, thank you. That was super, super interesting. And it's so clear that part of what makes this collection so interesting is your personal kind of memories and the way that you can create kind of context around when things came out the way that they did, why things came out the way that they did. So yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Would we like to take a few questions? Michael, are you up for that?
Oh, yeah.
Great. Anybody have some questions?
I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you. That was a really impressive collection of things to go
Sure,
through.
I wish it was my collection.
Yeah. And I can't wait to go see the show.
Cool. Well, for those of you that are West Coast, the show is, I think it's open Saturday the 3rd, and then the closing is Tuesday the 8th.
Okay.
And Simon Reynolds, who's a great music writer and journalist, is going to do a talk at the closing as well.
Amazing.
And it is, I mean, it's hard to capture it in the video, but there's so much stuff. And one of my favorite things about the show is just people come see it and they walk in and they're like, oh yeah, it's a bunch of old punk stuff, some British wanker showing all this stuff, and then they walk out and everybody has like a big smile and they're like, that was so cool, and I remember this and I remember that, and then the other side of the audience, there's there's a bunch of 18-year-old kids in punk bands that are looking back at this in a purely historical way, not in a nostalgic way. So there's this really nice overlap with those two audiences.
Yeah.
Michael, I have a question.
Sure. Hey, Max.
Hey, you kept referencing that they were working with really limited means, but the means you're talking about being an advantage weren't even available commercially to George Lucas, for example. Like,
Yeah.
So, and then I feel like they weren't working from a deficit. Anyone who's made something by hand quickly gets such a more satisfactory result and learns something about composition or technique. I just think that's as interesting. You kept saying that their means were stifled when you hadn't really invented, or those processes weren't even
Yeah.
available.
I mean, there were other professionalized processes. Maybe that is not necessarily about, say, the computer, because you're right, nobody had a computer then. But the difference is, like, I have some photos of how they printed the t-shirts, for instance, and it's in somebody's living room on a table with silk screens off the frame, pinned to the wall, and they're covered in ink and shit, and so versus having a studio where you could actually silk screen, for instance. So a lot of people didn't even have a physical space to make work. But for me, one of the big differences was typography. How you couldn't typeset anything, right? It was, and even when I was young, I remember I got taught how to typeset on a Berthold machine, and I got taught how to paste type up and use a Lucy, a copy stand to repro camera to photograph it, and it was very belabored and it was very expensive. So those things only really existed in a more commercial context. And I think the difference was people were kind of doing it in their own homes. I think that was that might be a better way of talking about that difference.
Yeah, I think I found that interesting because that's only, the lack of resources sort of created it sort of formulated a lot of the form making and limitate the constraints of any design. Typically are your biggest opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and the same thing with the history stuff, right? It's like the only references people had to pull on were art movements, were design being created for art movements. So like I said, you see like the Bauhaus, you see constructivism, you see Dada, situationists. What you don't see is a sort of the history of graphic design within a lot of this, until later, right? Until it starts to become more visible.
Yeah.
Because
Well, yeah,
at that time, there weren't even books about about the history of graphic design.
yeah.
It wasn't even called, it was still commercial art, and it was still really frowned upon as a shitty practice.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks for sharing that stuff. I'll try to make
Yeah.
this show.
Thanks for coming, mate.
Any other questions or things that people want to chime in? Observations? I thought that that was a really interesting point about, you know, the sort of like qualities of formal graphic design emerging closer to like maybe the end of the work that you showed, maybe more in the sort of new wave, you know, aesthetics that we were looking at, and how you were talking at the beginning about, you know, punk being something that you could only like punk, you could only like, it was so specific and so self-selecting and so, you know, total. And, you know, the aesthetics of sort of maybe that end of the spectrum reflected that specificity, and seeing over time, you know, the use of universal geometric shapes and grids and these
Yeah.
sort of more traditional, or not traditional, but like more like honed graphic design choices, as I sort of interpreted that as like a way of addressing like the a broader audience, basically.
Yeah, no, I think definitely, but I think also if you look at, you know, there's a Vivienne Westwood shirt that Johnny Rotten used to wear all the time, where the slogan at the top just says "destroy," right? And in a lot of ways, that was part of that early philosophy, right? But once you've, you know, once you've smashed everything, once you've destroyed everything, what do you do next? You can't keep smashing, you can't keep destroying. And that was what happened with punk. It had to be brief in that moment, and it was like a reset in a lot of ways, you know. And and then I think there was this moment where everybody looked around and go, okay, well, we can't do that, so what do we do? And then what punk did do was kind of kick open that door that was like, well, now you have permission to do anything. It's like a blank slate, and that eclecticism, I think, really came out of that way. And if you go back and read interviews with a lot of people from sort of 78, 79 that were starting bands, that was really their starting point was, well, I don't want to be in a punk band, but I can do anything. I've got permission to be to do whatever I want to do. And I think that's still the thing that's most appealing to me, is that kind of philosophy of just being able to do anything that you want, and that having value.
Yeah, well, I feel like that's definitely that has a lot of resonance in the current moment that we're living through. Do whatever you want, no rules, kind of. So yeah, thank you so much for that range and all of those great stories, and for spending all this time with us. We really, really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Sure, you're welcome. It's fun.
All right, well, thanks everyone for joining. Anyone else want to add anything before we close? Okay. Well, I'm going to post a recording of this on the same page you registered with, if you want to share it with anyone. And we'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye.